I made a joke last week about all the different theories that get floated around the FNAF fandom, especially some of the more obscure ones that have very specific names. And one of them that I'd never given much thought because I thought was impossible was ShatterVictim. It's a theory first posited by Cuban Fancy, and it's meant to explain what happens to the bite victim after the bite of 83. But after I read the week before, and there was some evidence that suggested that this theory may be true, I actually gave the theory a deep dive. And the more I've looked into the theory and compared it to what I found myself in the games, I actually really like it. Well, slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. So what is ShatterVictim? Well, typically on these videos, I like to define a theory and then find evidence for it along the way, but this theory is kind of a hard sell. So I think it'll be to the benefit of everybody, including the theory itself, to instead go over what evidence we do have about the crying child and then circle back to the theory. Or I guess if recent theories are true, the evidence we have about Dave Afton. Well, the majority of the information we know for sure about this kid comes from FNAF 4, specifically the minigames that you see in between the nights. They show us the lead up to what was at the time known as the Big Bite, according to the week before, but after the bite of 87 was then referred to as the bite of 83. A lot of the details from these minigames are not 100% confirmed, but the general swaths of what happens there is pretty certain. That being, Michael Afton and his friends picked on his younger brother, Dave, relentlessly for his fear of the animatronics. Now, Dave seems to have really liked the actual Freddy characters, but as far as the animatronics, he had this deep-seated fear, which was likely caused from him seeing something he wasn't supposed to. We have no inclination as to what he saw, but Fredbear at some point says, "Remember what you saw, you know what happens if he catches you." Eventually, the bullying from Michael escalates to a point where they hoist Dave up to give a kiss to the Fredbear animatronic, but they get too close and Dave's head goes inside of the mouth just as Fredbear's mouth closes, crushing Dave's skull and sending him to the hospital. We're fairly certain he goes to the hospital because of the IV bag, medicine, and flowers on the side of the table in FNAF 4. While he's in this unconscious state, we hear a few speakers. If the gray text is anything to go by, the first one being Michael, wondering if Dave can still hear him and apologizing. But then Fredbear begins to talk, and it says, "You're broken. We are still your friends. Do you believe that? I'm still here. I will put you back together." After this, a flatline is heard and it's presumed that Dave dies. And that's all we know directly about Dave from FNAF 4. But the crying child shows up several times throughout this franchise, albeit none as solid and clear as FNAF 4. So we'll go over all the other evidence throughout the franchise that might be pointing to the crying child, starting with the most likely and ending at the biggest stretch. First up being FNAF World. It seems fairly clear that the main point of FNAF World is to allow the crying child to move on and find peace. After all, the clock collecting playthrough of FNAF World begins and ends with a pair of eyes giving us instructions, and we're talked to by a glitchy Fredbear throughout it. And throughout this time, we hear things like we're leaving breadcrumbs for him, and something bad happened out there and it's affecting in here. Not to mention, the ending of the clock ending mirrors very well with the ending of the FNAF 4 minigames, to the point of having the same lines. So this feels very direct, and it seems like somebody is actively trying to put the crying child back together as was promised in FNAF 4. Because FNAF World is so closely related and linked to Dave Afton, we can, by association, add the Happiest Day minigames from FNAF 3. After all, whenever you collect a clock in FNAF World, you play a representation of one of the ways to access a Happiest Day minigame in FNAF 3. In FNAF 3, the Happiest Day minigames are a bit more detailed, where we play what seem to be arcade games that would have originally been found in the FNAF 2 location. But in each of them, we go out of bounds, seek out a crying child, and give them cake. Note I said a crying child, because if you only do one or some of these and then go to the Happiest Day minigame, there will be children wearing various Freddy's masks, but that's it. It's only when you collect all of the children in these minigames that when you go to the Happiest Day minigames, there's a fifth child on the other end of the table, to which you can give cake, he puts on a Fredbear mask, and then they all seemingly move on. It should be noted that twice now, we need to gather several things to help the crying child find peace. There's gotta be a meaningful landmark around here somewhere. I feel like I'm walking in circles. Oh, what's this? A sponsor. All right. Today's video is sponsored by Fume. We've all got bad habits. Mine is I fidget a lot, and fidgeting itself is take it or leave it, but I specifically gnaw on my cuticles whenever I'm bored or nervous or really just have a free hand. Well, lucky for me, there's an alternative that can help you kick that bad habit and you can take it anywhere you go. And that's Fume. Fume is an award-winning flavored air device that draws the flavor to your mouth. Now, I want to be super clear. This is not a vape. There's no vapor or nicotine or batteries or anything like that, because what's actually inside is a fume core. This right here. They're non-toxic, not addictive, and have great flavors. In fact, my favorite right now is crisp mint, and all you have to do is place the core in the device and close it. But all that aside, like I mentioned, I'm a fidgeter, and this feels like it was made for me. It clicks as you rotate to adjust it. It has a great mouthfeel for my fellow oral fixators, and now they have these chewable toppers, so I can chew on it. I am such a chewer, and I genuinely cannot recommend this enough. Also, they have a magnetic stand, like so. I don't even have to, you can spin it. Like, I didn't even have to tell you, you can spin it on this thing. Fume has served over 300,000 customers, and you can be their next success story. For a limited time, use my code RYTOAST to get your free topper. It's the perfect accessory for your Fume device. Slip it onto the mouthpiece for a softer, warmer feel. It's chewable for those who love to fidget, and it's reusable. Head to tryfume.com, that's tryfum.com, and use code RYTOAST, or scan the QR code on screen to get your free Fume topper when you order a journey pack today. Thanks again to Fume for sponsoring today's video. Alright, I guess we press onwards. Wait a minute. What is that? Is that a hole? Well, I guess it's something to explore. At least I might get some shade in there. Moving on to more speculative evidence is the crying child's appearances within the Security Logbook. Most FNAF fans agree that the altered text speaker of this book is the crying child. After all, the red ink is definitely Mike, he says so, and the faded text is a lot more vague. But the altered text speaks in a way befitting of the crying child, saying things like, "I'm scared and I can't see." Furthermore, whenever a question is asked of the altered text, it's created in a way that could work for the crying child, like this page where it asks if any of these toys are familiar, and one of them is the FNAF 4-bedroom phone. If the altered text in this book is the crying child, the thing that's useful for this theory is that it seems as though the crying child has lost nearly all of his memories by this point in the timeline, and he's not even sure what's going on anymore. And finally, most speculative is FNAF 1. Now, admittedly, this could be nothing. This could just be me losing my mind. But it's worth noting that one of the hallucinations in FNAF 1 is in this hallway, where all of the posters can change to a picture of a crying child. Now, this was probably made way before any of this was planned, so it was most likely meant to be like missing child incident shenanigans or whatever, but in retrospect, this might be important, almost as if the entire building is possessed by the crying child. So like I mentioned, throughout this franchise, at least twice after the crying child has died, it takes a group effort of collecting something to put him back together. It's also worth noting that his memories are likely gone. All this evidence in mind, what exactly is ShatterVictim? ShatterVictim is the theory that when the crying child dies, his soul essentially shatters. Or more accurately, his spiritual essence is spread amongst many things. Most importantly, the four main Freddys animatronics and Golden Freddy. Furthermore, in order to allow the crying child to find peace and rest, those pieces would need to be gathered and collected to make his memory whole again. And I know that's a lot, but it's not unprecedented. Before I even go back to the evidence, it needs to be noted that throughout the FNAF games and books and even the movie, memory and spirits are tied inextricably together, almost to a point that in the FNAF universe, you could describe a ghost as a manifestation of that person's memories when they were alive. But some of the evidence we've gathered so far leans a lot into this theory. The idea that in both Happiest Day and FNAF World, whether or not this is just the same event in different perspectives or steps of this process, regardless, it features pieces being collected in order to allow the crying child to rest. Even in the Happiest Day, those pieces are the other missing child incident victims. But I hear you, we may have evidence on why this works to bring him back, but do we have any evidence to suggest that a spirit could shatter? Well, we do, a few times, in the books. In the Fazbear Frights epilogues, Andrew is a spirit who attaches himself to William Afton specifically to torture him forever and keep him alive because he hates William Afton that much. He's basically doing an ultimate custom night within Fazbear Frights. But in one of the stories, The Man in Room 1280, William Afton convinces a priest to wheel his barely alive charred body into a Fazbear warehouse. And once there, William's body just explodes over everything nearby, infecting it with his agony. And as Andrew tells Jake, Andrew's spirit as well. In the fourth epilogue, we get Andrew recounting this moment. And if we pull out some of the quotes from those pages, we get this. "I know I was in him when we got to this big place with lots of cool stuff. All I can remember after that is wanting to be everywhere. I can remember being all over the place and all kinds of things. And I remember this animatronic dog, Fetch. So I think I was in Fetch, sort of. I think that's how I got here. I don't know why I think that. I just do. I infected them. I remember now. I infected everything I threw my anger at." So it seems as though when this happened, Andrew's spirit split up and went into all of those objects along with Afton's agony. And Andrew seems to believe he directly infected some of these objects just with the anger he threw their way. Throughout the next few epilogues, we see Jake trying to collect those objects using Andrew's thoughts in order to retrieve them, at first just to make sure nobody gets hurt, but by the end of it to help Andrew move on. At some point before they're done, Jake almost begins to find peace and rest and move on, but Andrew begs him to stay, because while Jake might be able to move on at this point, Andrew says he can't. He is trapped. It takes them collecting all of the objects that Andrew's soul has been split into, throwing them into a trash compactor with themselves, and then in that moment, Andrew's spirit is able to find peace and rest, but he cannot move on until the parts of him have been collected. And if FNAF's recent Golden Freddy theory is anything to be believed, there's a good chance that Andrew is actually the parallel for the crying child, which makes this evidence even stronger. The idea of not being able to move on until your soul and memory have been repaired is actually a common theme in FNAF. We see one example of it in Alone Together, but we see a direct example of it in The Silver Eyes, a completely separate series of books. In the third book, The Fourth Closet, Carlton gets injected with Remnant directly to his heart and goes unconscious. And while he's unconscious, he's able to interact with the other spirits in the room, the missing child incident victims. At first, only seeing the victim who was put in the Golden Freddy suit, who tells him he's trying to collect their memories to put them back together. In the graphic novel, we see this visualization of these scattered pieces of paper floating around, and when Carlton helps to collect them and organize them into pictures, suddenly, missing child incident victims start popping out of thin air. And once all of these memories are collected, Carlton is able to get through to these victims, tell them what's really going on, and eventually allow them to find peace. But while their memories are scattered about, they are unable to. So, we know for a near fact that memory and spirits are inextricably tied in the FNAF universe, and it's pretty clear that memories need to be fixed before soul is allowed to move on. So then the question becomes, all that can be true, but how did the crying child spirit end up in the Freddy's animatronics if he died in Fredbear's Family Diner? Well, we do have one possibility for that given to us once again in The Silver Eyes. In the first book of this novel trilogy, also called The Silver Eyes, there's a conversation about the memories we leave behind when we're alive. And Charlie, our protagonist, mentions she doesn't believe in ghosts, but she does believe that memories can haunt a place. In that conversation, Marla then says this quote, "I don't know, sometimes I have little moments where it's like there's something I forgot, something I regret, or that I'm happy about, or something that makes me want to cry, but it's only there for a split second, then it's gone. Maybe we're all shedding our fear and regret and hope everywhere we go, and catching up traces of people we've never met. Maybe it's everywhere." Before the bite of 83, Dave Afton is very clearly very close to the Freddy's characters. He calls them his friends, he remembers them after he dies, and it is notable that they're the things that show up in his unconscious state before he dies, but for some reason he's terrified of Fredbears, and I think it's safe to assume that Freddy's as well by the time of these minigames. So is it possible that after this fear starts, he starts to leave these terrified memories amongst all of the Freddy's animatronics that he's forced to spend times with. Suddenly, this ShatterVictim theory starts to form. And before we fully make it, I mentioned earlier that there was some new information that helps me further bolster this theory. And of course, it's the week before, because it's like the most important FNAF lore book ever released. But at some point in this book, you can punch in 1983 into the voicemail box, and if you do, you get an impossible recording of that day, where you can hear Michael picking on his brother, Dave begging them to stop. You can even hear, which we've never heard before, a staff member yelling at them to cut it out. And then we hear the crunch of the bite, and immediately after, Ralph, the phone guy who's listening in, gets bit by Freddy in a similar way. They both just say crunch. It's almost as if the crying child is haunting the entire establishment. An event that is not necessarily linked to the missing child incident is showing up in the voicemail box and compelling Freddy to almost recreate it in a way, almost as if that infestation is felt strongest in the animatronics. If this theory is true, what is the story of ShatterVictim? Well, let's pop all of this evidence into the oven and see what kind of horrors rise. In his life, Dave Afton loved the Freddy's characters and would play at the Freddy's location often, but then something happened that changed his perspective entirely. Whatever that something is unclear and is a theory for another day, but he saw something that made him terrified of these animatronics. But due to his brother looking after him since his father was never home, he was forced to still spend time around these very same animatronics. Throughout the rest of his life, his grief soaked into the very Freddy's animatronics that he used to love. Those characters are still his friends, but he couldn't bear the robots. And eventually, when the bullying comes to a head one day at Fredbear's, the bite of 83 happened. His mind is crushed inside of Fredbear's jaw, and as his body putters out, he hears that Fredbear plushie reach out to him, promising that they'll put him back together. And it's in that moment of death where his soul begins fleeting to the anchors of memory placed throughout the establishment, the Freddy's animatronics. Much like Ennard himself said, there's a little bit of me in every body. There's a little bit of Dave in every bot. Scattered like this, although his presence and crying can be heard throughout the establishment, he cannot find peace in pieces. Rest is impossible. But then, a long time after, there's a glimmer of hope. The end of FNAF 6 sees a fire to all of the remaining animatronics that still exist, and they all melt into one congealed mass, finally laying to rest. And it's in that moment, much like the trash compactor of Fazbear Frights, where all the pieces have been gathered. It's in this moment that I believe FNAF World is created, likely by Charlotte, the spirit of the marionette, or possibly Cassidy, the spirit of Fredbear. This realm of sorts is more so a manifestation of the efforts of one of these spirits to seek out the pieces of Dave's memory still in the rubble, finally putting the crying child back together and creating his happiest day. And it's in this moment, the modified, repaired version of the memory of his death, that Dave Afton is finally in one piece again and is able to find peace and rest. And that's essentially it. Once again, I'm not the original creator of this theory, and my interpretation of it may not perfectly line up with theirs. Go and follow them if you're more interested in the theory. But the more I look into this theory, the more things start popping up that line up with it, and the more I like it. But what about you? Do you believe it? It's definitely a little out there, but it's evidentiarily backed. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it in the comments below. In the meantime, if you somehow missed it, last week the second channel started posting videos again, starting with Pokemon. It's actually the best and worst Pokemon of each generation, starting with gens 1 through 5. Tomorrow we go through 6 through 9 and do the best and worst overall. So go and watch that video if you missed it, and I'll see you on the second channel tomorrow. Don't forget to use my code RYTOAST to get your free fume topper on tryfum.com. That's tryfume.com today. Thanks again for Fume to sponsoring today's video. In the meantime, if you want your fan art featured on the channel, make sure to share it with #ToastArt. A huge thank you to the best channel members, the Dough Risers, and until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.